Welcome to World Affairs Today, brought to you by the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C., a leading forum for global education and international affairs.
Good evening. My name is Stephanie Fassler, and I am the International Affairs Director for the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. On behalf of the Council, I welcome you to this Foreign Policy Panel and World Affairs Today program, The Latest Wave of Migration, Motivations and Responses. In mid-April 2015, a boat estimated to have carried over 800 people sank in the Mediterranean Sea, with only a couple dozen survivors. The occupants of the boat were migrants who had set sail from Libya in hopes of reaching the shores of Europe. Those on board came from Sudan, Nigeria, Syria, and as far as Bangladesh. This event has shone a spotlight on the plight of migrants risking death in an effort to improve their lives and that of their families. It has highlighted the struggle of destination countries to respond to the humanitarian crisis while dealing with pressures on policy and infrastructure. This is an issue not limited to the geographic region of the Mediterranean. Thousands arrive by boat in Southeast Asian countries and Australia from mainland Asia. Central Americans make the perilous journey across the desert to reach the United States. What is the motivation of these migrants to risk so much on a journey? What are the states doing to respond to this latest wave of migration? What can be done to prevent such tragedies from occurring, not just in the Mediterranean, but in the Indian Ocean and the Sonoran Desert? This evening's panel will seek to address those questions. Dilip Ratha is the head of the Global Knowledge Partnership on Migration and Development at the World Bank. He is also the manager of the World Bank's Migration and Remittances team in the Development Prospects Group. He is the lead for the Migration Working Group and the Diaspora Bond Task Force. He is a member of the World Economic Forum Council on Migration and of the Advisory Committee of the Migration Policy Center of European University Institute in Florence. He is credited as the first to analyze and formalize the global significance of remittances. Dilip also manages the popular blog People Move. Kathleen Newland is the co-founder of the Migration Policy Institute, where she is the director of the Migrants, Migration, and Development Program. She is also the founding director of the International Diaspora Engagement Alliance, a partnership between MPI, the State Department, and USAID. Previously, Kathleen was a senior associate and then co-director of the International Migration Policy Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. She is the author of over 8 books and worked as an independent consultant with such clients as the World Bank, Office of the Secretary General of the United Nations, and the UN High Commissioner on Refugees. Moderating tonight's panel is Sonia Michel, a former senior scholar at the Woodrow Wilson Center for International Scholars. Sonia's expertise includes migration, population, society and culture, urban studies, race and ethnicity, gender equality, and human rights. Her latest work is on a project which focuses on migrant women who become caregivers in the United States, with comparisons to Europe and Asia. For a couple weeks more, she's a professor of history at the University of Maryland College Park and just taught her final class of her teaching career this afternoon. So please join me in welcoming our distinguished panel.
Thank you, Stephanie. This is an exciting moment for me. I'm retiring from teaching, but not from life, and certainly not from intellectual life, and certainly not from the issues that we have before us. I'm really delighted to be here moderating this panel, and I'm delighted to have my 2 colleagues here who have such great expertise in this area. In thinking about tonight's panel, Stephanie gave us some ideas about questions that we might address, and she told me what the 2 panelists are going to talk about. But as I think about it, I just want to lay out a scheme that's been useful to me in thinking about immigration. As Stephanie mentioned, I'm involved now in a big project working on migration and care work, women who migrate to become care workers, who migrate from the poorer countries to the wealthier countries. And in thinking about it, we think about it at multiple levels. We think about the broad-scale transnational patterns of migration. We think about the laws and the regulations in the receiving countries. We think, of course, about the conditions in the sending countries that prompt people to migrate. And then we try to think about what happens at the local level, and especially because the women that we're looking at are care workers at the very intimate level, where workers are in households and are working with children, with elders, with people with disabilities on a very intimate level. But even though we're looking at that very intimate space, we're also thinking about it in this broader framework. So those levels, that's the way I sort of think about immigration. But of course, the current situation adds yet another level, both immediate, both geographic and temporal. And that is, of course, the crisis that Stephanie referred to in the Mediterranean in the last few weeks. And it's hard to think about this whole issue without thinking about those episodes, these incidents and this terrible loss of life, because it is obviously a crisis, and it's a crisis that needs to be dealt with, and it needs to be dealt with immediately. So while we're focusing on the immediate level, it's also important to think about the long range conditions that have led to this, and I'll get to that in a moment. So in tonight's panel, I hope we'll focus on at least three levels, and the first is that immediate crisis level. What has caused it? What are the immediate political crises that have led to this widespread migration? What is going on in terms of the people who are offering to transport migrants, often quite illegally under quite illicit circumstances, with very little concern about the safety and the security of the people they're transporting? What is happening to those people? And and what are the conditions that are leading up to that? Why are people feeling the need to flee even under these very insecure circumstances? And what are the rules and regulations, the laws at the receiving end that are causing them to step onto these flimsy boats and try to enter Europe? And I think, I'm sure Kathleen will talk about the laws that restrict migration so that people are forced to try to find some way to enter illegally and to risk their lives to do that. So that's one. So that's the immediate situation, and it's obviously crucially important to address it. And as we'll hear, the EU is beginning to address it, and other individual countries are beginning to address it. But let's not lose sight of the long-term issues, and that is, what are the immigration laws? What are the rules and regulations that are governing entry, not just into Europe, but into the United States, into Canada, into parts of Asia? There's migration is going on at a huge scale all over the world. And so what are the rules and regulations that are governing the entry of people? Under what conditions is it possible for people to safely, and under what conditions are they forced to migrate somehow under the radar, risking body and soul in order to do that? So that's another level to think about. So it's both geographically more diffuse and also temporally more long range, because these are policies that have been in place for a very long time. And one question is, what are the prospects for changing them, for making them more humane, more responsive to the conditions that are actually existing? And then, of course, the third level is, what are the sending conditions? There are obviously political conflict situations that are causing this immediate crisis, but they're also more deeply entrenched, more long-term, especially economic, but sometimes also social and political conditions that are prompting people to migrate. And of course, they're different in different places, but they're also very important to look at. And perhaps those are, on the one hand, more amenable to change, but perhaps less amenable to change insofar as they're very deeply entrenched and very systemic. They're part of global economic conditions. And how are you going to change the global economy to reduce the demand for migration? So those are the that's sort of a framework that I think would be kind of useful to keep in mind as we discuss these issues. But I know that both Kathleen and Dilip have much more detail and much more immediate research to report on. So I'm going to turn the floor over first to Kathleen Newman, who will talk about the current situation, the response of governments with reference to the UN Security Council meeting yesterday, and I guess the migration agenda for Europe that's going to come out tomorrow, which maybe you can give us a preview of. So, Kathleen, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks very much. Well, it's great to be here. Thank you, Sonia. Thank you, Stephanie, for arranging this. I'm going to talk about migration today, mostly in a context of crisis, the crises that Sonia mentioned. But before I start, I want to emphasize that that most migration is normal and positive, and the headlines tend to focus on the extraordinary and the extremely dangerous, the criminal, and so on. And so I don't want to leave the impression that this is what migration is about. I'm sure Dilip will emphasize in his remarks that the positive impact of migration and the fact that it's the most effective way for individuals to escape poverty. And so I feel kind of badly setting that aside to sort of talk about what is in the headlines, but much of my work is devoted to those positive aspects of migration. However, I also, at the Migration Policy Institute, work on the humanitarian aspects of migration. And that is what is very much in the headlines these days. The crisis in the Mediterranean is by no means unique. It is dominating the headlines both because it's in the range of the major Western media outlets, which tend to dominate media coverage worldwide, although I must say I've been doing a lot of interviews on Al Jazeera and China television in the last few days, so that was kind of heartening to see that this is becoming seen as more of a global issue. But in addition to the Mediterranean, where the numbers are dominant this year, but not so much in previous years. If you had looked at this 4 or 5 years ago, the hot spot would have been the Gulf of Aden, with migrants primarily from Somalia and to a lesser extent Ethiopia traveling by boat. Estimated death rate 5 years ago of 5% of all those who tried to make that journey. And most people going to Yemen as a transit point, trying to move on to Saudi Arabia and other Gulf countries where the demand for labor was very high. We've seen just in the last few days a spike in illegal maritime arrivals in the Bay of Bengal and south into Southeast Asia, mostly originating from Burma and from people who have first gone to Bangladesh and are now leaving Bangladesh, where they've faced very really dire conditions. In 2012, 2013, the spotlight was very much on Australia, which was seeing a peak in maritime arrivals. Nothing like the numbers in the Mediterranean. The peak in 2013 was about 20,000 people, but Australia is a small country. I mean, that's in terms of population, and that was a serious matter in Australia, and quickly became a political crisis. So the unauthorized flows, which are the ones that, of course, get governments excited, have changed in a number of ways, or I mean, these aren't massive changes, but sort of changes at the margin. One of them certainly is the increased number of people moving by sea. Another, which I'm sure has been in your consciousness, particularly last summer, was the increase in child migration, unaccompanied minors. 137,000 unaccompanied children or children with an immediate family member crossed the U.S.-Mexican border. This was a big spike from previous years, and again, one of the characteristics of unauthorized migration is its ability to generate political crisis in the receiving countries, that sense that things are out of control, that the government is failing in a fundamental duty, and this sort of ratchets up the stakes, I think, in dealing with unauthorized migration. Maritime migration seems to have particular resonance. It sort of conjures up images of invasion and the sort of lawlessness of international waters, although they aren't lawless. In fact, the International Law of the Sea has many provisions dealing with maritime migration and dealing with rescue at sea. An important characteristic of these flows are that they're a mixture of refugees and other people who are in need of international protection and are subject to the international protection regime, entitled to the protections that countries have signed up to and that have made their way into customary international law, and non-refugees, people who are, but I have to say it's becoming more and more difficult to draw a bright line between refugees and non-refugees, unless you adhere to a very strict definition of the Refugee Convention. Many of the people who are moving who don't fall under that sort of strict refugee definition are migrating under some form of compulsion, and particularly for many of them, the compulsion of extreme poverty. So I know I'm supposed to confine my opening remarks to just a few minutes, so
I'll give you a few more.
I'll mention just sort of a few of the sort of policy issues that sort of come out of the situation in which we find ourselves. I've mentioned that these flows tend to generate political controversy in the receiving countries, particularly with the rise of right-wing populist parties in many European countries. I should say parties or factions of parties. Right-wing populist parties or factions tend to seize upon migration as a wedge issue, and the response of more mainstream parties so far seems to have not been to counterattack, but rather to try to co-opt people who might be attracted to those parties by sort of following along with milder versions of their prescription. So we've seen a sort of race to the bottom in political rhetoric in many countries, and I think you saw that, you know, in last week's election in the United Kingdom, where even the Labour Party, traditionally more friendly to immigrants, has been drawing some pretty hard lines, sort of competing with rather than opposing the anti-immigration rhetoric. Another tendency of governments in facing these flows is to address the symptoms rather than the causes. Now, this has to do somewhat with the sort of temporal urgency of dealing with things like deaths at sea on your doorstep. Particularly when you have a figure like Pope Francis, who carries great moral authority, saying, you know, we can't allow the Mediterranean to become a cemetery, and calling on people to respond to a fundamental sense of common humanity in the face of these migration flows. So so governments are faced with a very, I mean, this is an extremely difficult problem. You know, it's not a question of just lack of political will or political cowardice or any of that. This is a really difficult problem to deal with, unauthorized migration under many of the migrants operating under a degree of compulsion. So there are these short-term, mostly humanitarian imperatives, save lives, that the High Representative of the European Union, Vice President of the European Union responsible for foreign affairs, emphasized very much at the Security Council last week that Europe's top priority was saving lives. Well, you wouldn't know it from their actions, in fact, since the search and rescue operation that was run by the Italian Navy throughout 2014 was halted in the face of non-cooperation from other European countries, and the Italian government, in continuing fiscal crisis, felt that it could not continue the effort on its own. What the EU replaced that with was a border protection operation that had a grand total of 6 vessels at its command, operated no more than 35 miles from European coastlines, had 1 helicopter and 2 light aircraft. And needless to say, the death toll has gone up dramatically in 2015. It's running at this point at about 20 times the rate of last year. 1,829 known deaths in the Mediterranean so far this year. The sort of medium-term responses, how the discussions have been about opening more legal channels for migrants to move through so that they don't have to take to the boats. I should add the other short-term imperative that seems to be motivating European governments in a very animated way is disrupting criminal networks. And you've probably heard that the European countries are seeking a Security Council resolution that will authorize them to use force in Libyan territorial waters, as well as in international waters, in order to stop and destroy smugglers' boats. There is very little detail about how they intend to accomplish this, and a great many questions that remain to be answered. As Sonia mentioned, dealing with the sort of root causes of these migrations, making greater and more successful efforts to bring peace to Syria, to the Central African Republic, to Somalia, to northern Nigeria, to Afghanistan. It's a long-term prospect, you know. What I have said in addressing policymakers on this issue of maritime migration is, you know, the one thing that you must not expect to do is solve this problem. Just, you know, don't be under any illusion that you're going to solve this problem. You can make it better. You can reduce the human toll. But this is a problem that you're going to be managing for many years to come, and that will require long-term attention, resources, and political capital to even get to a manageable point. Let me make just one more point before I close, which is that, as I'm sure you're well aware, there is no United Nations organization devoted to migration. There is one devoted to refugees, who are a relatively small proportion of international migration. We have an International Organization for Migration, which is a multilateral agency that has made great strides in recent years. It's gone from about, I think, 47 members 10 years ago to 157 today. So it's nearing, you know, something approaching universality, although it still has some very large holdouts like China and Russia. Since 2001, at least, the United Nations officials have been discussing how the UN should cope with migration. I've been a part of almost all those discussions, and I can say, despite many good people working on these efforts, they have not borne much fruit so far. So they're fragmented pieces of action in the international system. Dilip heads an important one, which is trying to solidify the evidence base about migration. But there's no unified international institutional approach to migration. And that is something that I and others continue to work on, and I think would be something of a help in coming to grips with these issues.
Great, thank you very much, Kathleen. Dilip?
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here and to talk about this timely issue. I'll compliment what Kathleen said, and just to make a point that somewhere around 30,000 people are estimated to have arrived in Europe, and 1,829, so 1,829 have so far died. That's the sort of statistic, and the situation is reaching, in a way, at least in the news media, crisis proportions. And as Kathleen also pointed out, there is a political backlash and race to the bottom in the political rhetoric, with the sort of collateral damage, and that collateral damage might actually move front and center, and could be there is a threat that rhetoric could actually lead to permanent policy changes that might shut the door on the right kind of migration. And that's my real worry, that because of the death of, let's say, 2,000 people, I'm really terribly sorry about the situation. It's really horrible that in these modern times, people should have to die desperately in the way they are dying. It's a shame on us. But we are talking about 200 or 250 million international migrants globally, out of which 93%, 9 out of 10 migrants are economic migrants. Refugees are about 3% of the international migrant stock. Most of the people that are migrating for economic purposes. If Mediterranean is now perceived as the deathbed for a whole lot of people, Mediterranean is also the play field for a whole lot of people. It's a beautiful place. So let's not change the beauty of migration to the darkness that we seem to perceive from the current situation. And that is my real worry. And we must avoid going that dark route. And it's nice to think about disrupting criminal networks. We ought to. Of course, by definition, criminal networks ought to be disrupted, and we have to address that problem. But we have to also be careful about not stopping people who are desperate to move from escaping the persecution, the poverty, the crime, whatever deprivation they are facing. So there has to be an escape route for people. We are supposed to be in the 21st century of civilization. We are not barbarians of the past, when we thought anybody who is not from our tribe was somebody to either kill or to eat. We are not in that age anymore. So just for our own sake, we have to put things in perspective. And yes, we have to deal with the crisis, but let's not sort of think that this crisis is all there is, that there is no bigger picture, no silver lining to the whole situation. And we ought to have a legal route for refugees who must escape. They ought to be able to escape. Economic migrants, they probably voluntarily would move or would go back if they don't find a job out there. So perhaps they are less of a worry, but there ought to be a legal channel for economic migration as well. It is the criminal elements that we must go after. And the criminal element, unfortunately, happens to be the needle in the haystack. It's about the same proportions, by the way. And the key is to find the needle and to break it rather than to burn the haystack. So that's my worry. And I would like to point out there that there is a near-term approach to the crisis situation. There is a medium-term approach and there is a long-term approach. The near-term approach has to be about providing a humanitarian assistance to all the people who are desperate, to rescue the people who are already stranded or about to embark on the journey. We have to provide information to potential migrants who are taking to the sea about the risks that they are facing. I think most of them actually know about it, but it is entirely possible that they can't separate the criminal from the real Robin Hood. And they might be underestimating the risks. We might be able to point out to them that there are actually severe risks associated with undertaking these journeys. And then in the near term, I think we have to sharply increase vigilance over the activities of smugglers and the criminals. That is the near-term objective. In the medium term, I think we have to open legal channels for the refugees and asylum seekers. Think about the Syrians. Think about now the Nepalese. You know, Nepal has 2 million, somewhere between 2 to 3 million international migrants. Remittances to Nepal are right now 30% of GDP. And this year, because of the crisis, I expect GDP to fall, remittances to increase, which means it would reach 40% of GDP. When there is a crisis, remittances are the first form of help to rush in. Because of the crisis, there will be more out migration from Nepal. Are we going to stop those people from moving out? Is it the same sort of permanent earthquake that many of these countries in North Africa are facing? And that is what is prompting them to move. So in the medium term, I think we really have to think about opening legal channels for economic migration, for humanitarian migration, for family reunification. And then there is the whole issue of how do we manage the current crisis, whether it is 30,000 people or whatever number of people have come to Europe, or how many more might come later this year and next year and the year after. That small number of people, it's not in millions, it is in more like thousands, hundreds of thousands perhaps, but it is not in millions. Those people, they to an extent present a global burden on countries. So if they come to Italy, they come to Spain, it is not only Italy's problem, it is not only Spain's problem, it is actually a global problem. And there ought to be a way to think about global burden sharing. So that would include not only taking people in and thinking about, you know, which country will take how many people, and you know whether they should go to Minnesota or whether they should go to certain place in Switzerland or in Germany. It is also about the fiscal aspects of it. They might enter through Italy and Spain, or particularly through Italy, but you know we need to think about a global solution. And there, we ought to also remember that most of the refugees in the world are not in rich countries. Most of the refugees in the world are in the south. And the burden on those countries, like Pakistan is probably the largest destination for refugees right now, largest host for refugees. That's a very poor country. So we need to think about global burden sharing. So these people, they are not only looking towards Europe, they happen to be thinking about Europe because that's what seems like on the horizon, but they would be quite willing to go to other places as well. So that message of global burden sharing ought to be part of the thinking process on this question.
I think that Kathleen mentioned that you referred a little bit to the what's it called, the European, no, the migration agenda for Europe. which I think actually begins to address, at least on a regional level, this kind of burden sharing that Dilip mentioned. Kathleen, I wonder if you could say a little, I know that the agenda hasn't been released yet, it's going to be released tomorrow, but I wonder if you have some advance information about it.
Yeah, a little. I mean, I don't think there are going to be any enormous surprises in the main outlines of it. They are going to try to tackle this question of distribution of refugees throughout the European Union. Currently, you have 4 countries that are bearing the great burden of these maritime arrivals. Burden in the short term. I mean, in the longer term, these people can become assets, but in the short term, it's certainly a big responsibility. And that is obviously Greece and Italy, the countries of the littoral countries that are receiving the boats, and Germany and Sweden, which are the primary destinations for onward movement from Italy and Greece. Countries with both generous asylum policies and thriving economies. And in the case of Sweden, they are paying the price for their past generosity, particularly toward Iraqi refugees and currently toward Syrian refugees, where they regard any Syrian, as for quite a while they did Iraqis, as being a sort of prima facie refugee. So their asylum grant rates are extremely high for both of those groups. And of course, people know that. So the European Commission has tried to come up with what they call a distribution key, a sort of formula for the distribution of refugees around Europe based on the size of the country, the size of the population, its economic strength, level of unemployment, and we don't know what other factors might go into that formula. And of course, that is, the devil is in the details, as always. And then the other big sort of pillar of this agenda is trying to disrupt the smuggling networks, which, as I said earlier, is very uncertain really how they plan to do that. The Australian government has been trumpeting their success around Europe, and the Australian foreign minister said today that European politicians have been flocking to her to ask, the secret of their success. Well, the secret of their success has to do with being a remote island continent, which Europe is not, last time I looked. And I think that those people who think that they can follow the Australian example of stopping the boats are really operating under a delusion. Australia instituted a draconian policy in September 2013 when the current government was elected, of really aggressive border patrol and reaching out into international waters and indeed pushing boats back into the territorial waters of Indonesia, making deals with the government of Sri Lanka to accept people who had not been through proper asylum procedures, and returning them directly to Sri Lanka. So, and then opening offshore processing centers in very, very poor neighboring, almost neighboring, except that Australia doesn't have any real neighbors, which is to their advantage in this respect. But making it clear that people who are intercepted at sea by Australia, who are found to be refugees, would be taken to processing centers in Nauru or Papua New Guinea, and would have the option of settling there or in any other country that agreed to participate in Australia's scheme, in this regional scheme, which now includes Cambodia as well. So second prize is 2 weeks in Philadelphia, as they say. So a very, very harsh policy, which has had the effect of deflecting these flows to other countries in the region, which are much less capable of absorbing them than Australia. But they did stop the boats. And one advantage of that is that there have been no deaths at sea in the approaches to Australia since December of 2013.
So, Dilip, I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about these patterns. What are the strategies that people are using? Are they migrating individually, or the husbands migrating first and hoping to bring the rest of their families, or families migrating together? And in what ways do you see immigration laws as really functioning as kind of family laws? Because they're saying, you know, this member of the family can come, but not these. They can't bring the rest of their families. Or, you know, what are the complications that occur in family life as a result of immigration laws? I wonder if you could speak to that.
Yes, primarily, 9 out of 10 migrants who are crossing borders are looking for a job. So when we make policies like certain people can come, certain other people can't come, we have point-based system, doctors can come, economists can't. I'm an economist, by the way. I take that personally.
It was meant personally for you.
So that kind of policy just doesn't make sense. The cherry picking, we want you, we don't want you. We want white, we don't want black. We want black, we don't want brown. We want yellow, we don't want that. There are countries out there in Africa which says that if you're not black, you are not a citizen, ever, ever. I mean, just doesn't make sense. So there is a bigger question out there. Who does this land belong to? Are we at a time when the nation and the state should be the same? The lines in the sand we draw everywhere, we have drawn everywhere, do they still make sense in the modern economy? Or should we actually go back to the land of international maritime laws and say that it's for all? We need the police, not the borders. I'm talking about big things out there. I know nobody will do that, but there is that sense of thinking about going beyond the current crisis, because migration, movement of people is not separable from economic change. I mean economic change, I'm not saying economic growth, I'm not saying economic decline. Whether you have a decline or growth, some sectors must decline more than others, some sectors must grow faster than others. People must move from the lagging sector to the leading sector. People must move. Migration is economic development. Migration is economic change. If we want economic change, we must have migration. Some of that migration crosses over to different borders. So the Virginians come to Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. people go to work in New York or in Maryland, and that's normal. Then how far can you take? Can they spill over the border to Ontario? Should they spill over the border beyond the southern border? And that then put that in the context of Africa. Less than 1 billion people. All of Africa, less than 1 billion people. Sub-Saharan Africa, more like 700 million people. 47 countries in Sub-Saharan Africa alone. 47 countries. Less than 1 billion people. 54 countries, less than 1 billion people in Africa. India alone has more than 1 billion people. China has more than 1 billion people. What does that mean? An act of simply going to school somewhere, taking up a job somewhere, getting married to someone you love, and live with that person becomes an act of international migration in Africa. So migration is essential to all of us, and then we have drawn the lines in the sand and then made all the complications. So in that context, your question of who migrates, those who are trying to get a job, not because they love to migrate, but because they have to. And there, let's put things in perspective. 250 million people, that's about 3% of the world's 7 billion people. That's all that migrates. International migration is only 3% of the world population. 97% of the people don't migrate. They live, work, and die where they were born, in the same country. Even if income differences are, we are talking about Ethiopia versus United States. We are talking about Myanmar versus Singapore. We are talking about Orissa, my poor state in India, versus Goa, the richest state in India. Areas are not all in Goa, even though there are no borders. What I'm trying to say is migration is the exception rather than the rule. Migration is painful. Leaving your parents, leaving your own society, moving away is not a fun thing to do. So are we really looking at a specter of all these masses coming to live in the US or to live in Europe? There is migration pressure. There is the sense of tolerance, how much migration can be tolerated, how many foreigners can be tolerated, how many people who don't speak like us, eat like us, talk like us, how many people can we live with? Those are important questions. But at the center of it is the question of national identity and personal identity. And we really haven't thought through that. So a few things here. I went on a tirade there, but a few very concrete things. 3% of the world's people are international migrants. How important are they to, let's say, the countries from which they come? 3%, this 250 million international migrants sent home last year 436 billion US dollars as remittances. $436 billion is officially recorded remittances. This is poor people's money, $200 here, $100 there, sent by the janitors, the gardeners, the construction workers. It adds up to rivers of foreign currency for many of these countries. Compare that with all the official aid that the donor countries, the rich donor countries are giving out. About a month ago, the new statistic came out, is $135 billion only. $135 billion only. So these poor people are the ones that are actually providing a lifeline to their families back home. The interesting fact is that now we have realized south-south migration is larger than south-north migration. So more people from poor countries are going to other poor countries. So Bangladeshis are going to India, Zimbabweans are going to South Africa, Tajikistan people are going to Russia. There is a lot more south-south migration than south-north migration. And going forward, migration is going to increase further. So migration is here to stay. That's the reality of it. And these migrants are providing a lifeline to their countries back home. And in that process, we have this sense that, while we like more trade flows because that helps everyone, more investment flows because that economically is beneficial to everyone, we don't want more migration flows because what? I think it is, in the end, a fear of strange people, a fear of the unknown, fear of people that we don't know how to deal with. You can put that as genuine fear, or you can say that it is simply lack of familiarity and perhaps lack of civilization.
Well, these are big questions, but should we open the floor for, yeah, but let's open, and I have many more questions, but we can open. Would you please use the mics?
I don't know if it was Kathleen that had mentioned that when migrants are leaving and they're sending money back home, or maybe was that you?
Anyway.
Okay. Is that part of the reason why the governments are maybe less inclined to opening their doors or making easier legal pathways? Is it because the money is not being put back into the country to which they're migrating to? It's being sent out. Is that at all part of the worry?
There've been one or two kind of fringe comments from, I can't remember which U.S. congressman who sort of criticized migrants because they're taking money from the United States and sending it to another country. So that's your question, the
Yes.
nature of your question, right? It astonishes me that anyone in a rich country could be concerned about that. The flows are very large in relation to the economies of the countries of origin, but in terms of the U.S. economy, it's a drop in the bucket. And I think one of the lessons that we learn from this whole atmosphere of crisis surrounding migration is that rich countries have a stake in what happens in poor countries. So if poor countries are benefiting from remittance flows in a way that makes them more economically and indeed perhaps politically stable, that's good for us as well as for that country. And the idea, it seems to me very sort of penny wise and pound foolish to think that remittance flows are a loss to the United States. or to any other developed country. I mean, the likelihood is that at least a portion of those remittances will flow back to us in the form of purchases of U.S. manufactured goods or U.S. produced foodstuffs or U.S. provided services.
But I'm wondering if that is kind of hindering why they're not making it easier for migrants. Okay, thank you.
Thanks. If I could just follow up for 1 second, Dilip, well, both of you, but I think Dilip especially. I mean, isn't the assumption that you said before migration is part of economic development, and if the assumption is that migrants are going to developed countries, earning money, sending back remittances, isn't the sort of idea that eventually things will even out a little bit? Are they leading to greater development in the sending countries or not? And if not, why not?
Yes, you could say, where evidence is clear-cut is remittances reduce the poverty head count rate. So again, take the example of Nepal before the earthquake. 1994-95, Nepal's poverty head count rate was about 43%, and a decade later, that has come down to 31%. That had come down to 31%. We don't have the latest figure now, and with the earthquake, of course, we wouldn't know what the damage would be. That 11 percentage point decline in poverty head count rate, about 50% of that to about 2/3 of the decline is due to remittances, and a large amount of remittances actually are coming from India, which is another poor country. So there is evidence that remittances reduce poverty. There is evidence that remittance recipient families send children a bit more than other households to school.
Mm-hmm.
So the school enrollment ratio is higher for families that receive remittances. It is also true that the birth weight of children in Sri Lanka is higher for children of households that receive remittances. So these are some of the evidence about the beneficial impact of remittances. It does cause convergence in some sense, but if there are so many other factors that are working against the country, then what do you do? So as I said, I am not aware of any countries that has emptied out or that has a significant chunk of migration that is big enough to change the country, the nature of the sending country. It has always been small. It has always been the tail wagging the economy. Now, in some countries, especially smaller countries, remittances are propping up the economies. So one way to look at it is that without remittances, those economies would be much worse off.
Mm-hmm. So like the Philippines, for example.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
My name is Magdalena, and I was made in Europe, and I'm American citizen, so I'm one of the people who migrated. The question dovetails to what you touched on, that right now the most impact of migration is in Europe. Is there any recognition by the bodies who work on the issue in the fact that Europe has extremely liberal welfare policies? And that is a hindrance in itself. Europe was very proud of establishing these very liberal policies, which, by the way, we don't have. So we don't understand what it is to take immigrants and have to pay for them not working for 2 years just to learn language. That's what happened in Germany, which creates these societies to say, it's enough, we cannot handle it. Is there any way to address this issue?
Yes, it's a very good question, and something that actually as recently as last week, I was last Thursday, I was having this very discussion with a Swedish colleague, with Eva, and said, this completely baffles me that the Europeans protect their labor market and open their welfare system to refugees. Whereas in this country, we do exactly the opposite. We keep migrants out of the welfare system, but open our labor market, and as a result, people are much more accepting here of migrants. Didn't it ever occur to you to do that? She said, we could never do that in Sweden. I mean, it's an article of faith in Sweden that you protect the labor market. and, you know, the unions are very strong, and, you know, wage levels are high, and that is an important part. So the idea of a more liberal, small L, labor market is something that in many, I think particularly Northern European sort of corporatist societies, is just something that democratic choice does not want. You know, people want to maintain. But I agree with you. I mean, the sight of sort of healthy young Afghan men sitting around in public housing and not working is something that drives people nuts, and I can understand it. But that has been a collective choice, though perhaps not always one about which ordinary people are very well informed. This is the trade-off that we have chosen. I think it's changing to some extent. You're finding less generous benefits for asylum seekers, but still a lot of reluctance to embrace permanent additions to the labor market.
There was actually a study done by OECD 2 years ago, and it was a major report actually, where they head-on addressed the question of whether migrants contribute more to the to the tax system, or they draw more from the tax system, from the public public services. Do they contribute more in taxes, or do they take away more in terms of benefits? And their finding was that for all of Europe, and in fact Europe is the extreme, as you say, in Europe, migrants were contributing more to the tax system than they were taking away, despite those Afghans and all that. Yeah.
Well, OECD is a pretty rigorous organization,
Yeah.
and they did run the numbers, and I think you know, in order to explain why that's the case, you have to understand the ratios. I mean, the foreign-born population in Europe, in many European countries, is still relatively low, and most migrants in those countries are working. They're not it's the asylum seekers who are kept out of the labor market. And asylum seekers are, and refugees are, a very small proportion of European populations. So the migrants who are working are contributing. They're creating wealth, as working people do everywhere, even if they're in relatively modest jobs. There are those who are kept out of the labor market, asylum seekers and refugees. Although now, I think in most European countries, refugees have the right to work once they are accepted as refugees.
But I don't know whether those numbers include intra-European migrants, because of the tremendous amount of migration from Eastern Europe to Western Europe. And a lot of those people are, in fact, creating the welfare state. But they
I
aren't.
do hate to cut off the discussion, but we have reached the end of our time for this evening. So Sonia, Kathleen, Dilip, thank you very much for your time this evening and your expertise. Please join me in thanking our panelists.
Thank you for joining us for World Affairs Today, a production of the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. Stay connected with us at www.worldaffairstoday.org.